All right, let's take a look at the labor movement of the late 1800s. So, we've been talking about industrialization and the problems that are associated with it. So, think of like the really poor work conditions, working for long hours, low wages, unsafe work environments. Eventually, there's pushback. The laborers, the workers are starting to organize and they're starting to try and fight back to gain some rights, gain a better workday, a shorter workday, better pay, safe work environment. Um, you know, a lot of these families were everyone was working, the women, the men, even the children. Some young as 5 years old were working. There was no compensation. If you got injured at work, well, that's too bad. You're probably fired, and that's it. Um, the factories themselves were unsafe. They were poorly ventilated. There were all sorts of health issues that would arise from working in these poor conditions. 1882, 675 laborers killed in work-related accidents every week. So safety is not the concern, right? It's the bottom dollar for the industrialists. Whatever they can do to cut costs, safety measures are going to increase production costs, and they don't have time for that. They're looking to cut corners and save money, and they're not looking out for the welfare of their workers. So again, looking for better working conditions, better pay, safe conditions, and they're going to start to form unions. Unions collectively have more authority, more power, uniting the workers as opposed to like individual laborers trying to fight for rights. Um, you've got some unions that were kind of open to all workers of all races and all both sexes. Some unions were more geared towards certain groups of people, were discriminatory towards minorities, discriminatory towards women. But one of the big tactics or one of the strategies they were looking to get was collective bargaining. So being able to have the union sort of represent the groups as a whole. Collective bargaining would be the unions negotiating with the employers to try and find an agreement. Um, Unions would also use tactics such as strikes, protests, boycotts, and sometimes they would even resort to sabotaging the work environment itself. Anything to push back against the wealthy industrialists or company owners. Those were some of the strategies they could do. Going on strike, obviously, meaning they're just not going to work. They could have protests. They could picket out in front, try and create awareness of the causes that they're looking for. Boycotts, they're essentially going to stop using or purchasing the goods produced from the company. And of course, sabotaging, disrupting the production or causing damage to the factory or work environment would certainly hurt production and cut into the profits. Um, Most strikes were not successful. They often resulted in violence. It created more anti union sentiment and feelings. The CEOs, the companies, the industrialists would kind of spin that in a way to make the strikers look like they're the ones disrupting production and that they're the bad guys. Um, so it often didn't result in a positive image for the unions, and rarely did it actually benefit the workers and end up with them getting more rights or getting what they wanted. Um, boycotts proved to be more efficient and more effective. They were mostly used in small towns, and they seem to be more effective in those smaller town sections. The sabotage route, again, effective, but also it had a lot of drawbacks to it too. I mean, it helped paint the unions in a very negative light. It was easy for the owners to really portray them as like socialists or communists. These people who were very anti-American values and American government system and American capitalism. So once they would damage the factories or damage the workplace, it was easy to kind of point the finger and say, aha, this is the problem. This is why we don't like unions, because they're nothing but a bunch of communists who are looking to bring down the system. So, but again, the unions and the workers were kind of limited in what they can do. The sabotage route, the strikes, the boycotts, that at least put something in their hands that was something they could do. So businesses were aware of the potential that unions could have on their business. So they were, very willing and aggressive in fighting back. Like I said before, they're looking to portray the unions in a negative light. They would have these smear campaigns in the newspapers, telling a sort of slanted side or version of stories of what goes on in the strikes, who's associated with them. So any way they could try and tie in negative associations with certain groups, like I said, socialist, communism, these sort of governments or governing systems, economic systems, those philosophies were very much different in opposition to the free market capitalist system that had allowed the industrialists to sort of accumulate their wealth. So anything that would disrupt what the monopolists had created and how they had gained their wealth, they were very much opposed to that and wanted to portray it in a negative light. Businesses also had the government on their side in a lot of cases. They often had the police forces. There was a lot of corruption, a lot of money exchanging hands in exchange for legal protection from the government, legal protection from police forces. Businesses would also use lockouts. They would tell their employees not to come to work until they had finally come to terms with what the owners were putting on the table. Like, we're not going to negotiate, no collective bargaining, no union talk. It's our way or the highway. That's it. You're locked out. No one's getting paid. No one's doing anything. And again, these wealthy industrialists could do a lockout because they're rich, they're wealthy. They probably have a stockpile of money that they can sit on and, ride out the lockout. Whereas the poor laborers, they probably don't have a savings. They need to go back to work. So oftentimes the lockout was a really effective strategy to end strikes or to end boycotts or anything that the unions could throw out at them. Another way to fight back that the industries were using were these yellow dog contracts. Basically, when you got hired by a place, you had to promise that you would never join a union. And if it was found out that you did join a union or you were participating in union activities, you could be fired on the spot. Another way that business would fight back was through the use of strike breakers. Fine, all the employees are on strike. We'll just hire in a new set of people. You're all fired. These new people are in. And of course, this created some resentment between the strikers and the scabs, as they're called, the replacement workers. And oftentimes would be violent clashes between the scabs and the original workers for crossing the picket line. And the other thing, if you were caught in a strike or any union activities, you could be blacklisted. So not only would you be fired from your job, but then you would be on a list in which the businesses would distribute to all the other major businesses. And if you're on that list, they're not going to hire you. So you run the risk of putting your livelihood in jeopardy, your family's livelihood in jeopardy, by not being able to get work in that particular town or city if you're on that blacklist. So high risk, high reward sort of scenario here. You're fighting for your labor rights, but joining these groups and participating in these strikes and whatnot could also lead to some pretty severe punishments and repercussions. Specific type of labor groups. The first major union group we have is called the Knights of Labor. And for its first few years, it's kind of this underground secretive labor group. Its members were open to both skilled and unskilled laborers. They were open to blacks and to women. They were sort of this anti-capitalist sort of approach. They felt that capitalism had kind of gone off the rails and it had sort of favored the wealthy industrialists too much. And that, the greed and corruption of everything was sort of taking away from the bulk of society. The majority of people who were poor, working class, weren't getting enough under this corrupt sort of capitalist system. It's one of the first unions to really organize strikes. They supported limited immigration, restricting child labor. They were really pushing for an 8-hour workday, equal pay for men and women who were doing the same job. They were kind of on board with the Grange movement, the Farmers Alliance, and the Populists in their views towards like railway restrictions in terms of like the prices. So they wanted to see more federal regulation and oversight of the rail systems. And it became one of the largest labor unions in the United States. And in 1886, it kind of has a setback with the Haymarket riots. This is in Chicago. This is peaceful sort of like protest going on over labor issues, and someone throws a bomb at these cops and it ends up killing some cops, and they kind of convict 8 people on some really, really loose evidence. But again, that sort of negative press leads to negative associations with the Knights of Labor and unions in general. So they kind of start out with this really good union, but then the Haymarket incident kind of portrays them in a more negative light. The next group, the next major union is the American Federation of Labor, the AFL. And this is like more for skilled laborers. It's a craft union. So you have to be part of a specific craft set in order to be in the AFL. You can't be just like a manual laborer, guy who just digs a ditch, or, real simple, repetitive manual, like skilled labor. Like you are a machinist, you are an operator. Something with a specific skill set would qualify you to be in the AFL. They did believe in capitalism. They just wanted to see it tweaked a little bit to favor more of the workers' rights. Their main focus was on higher wages and on safer working conditions. They were really focused on keeping its members united. They preferred the collective bargaining approach, but they did use strikes. They did use boycotts occasionally. So big difference between the KOL and AFL. Knights were like more willing to strike. AFL is more like, let's negotiate. Let's go through collective bargaining. Another big one was the American Railway Union, founded by Eugene Debs. He wasn't really a socialist to begin with. He was more associated with the Populist Party. And in 1901, he does switch over and become a socialist. In terms of political significance, Debs runs for president 5 times under the Socialist Party. In one election, he actually gained 6% of the votes, which doesn't seem a lot, but it's a big chunk. So, again, the ARU, this is Debs. They're pushing for better conditions in the railroad systems. The railway system is this huge industry by itself, and making sure that this massive industry, this massive cog in the industrial wheel is representing its workers and treating them fairly. This was a pretty big union that did some pretty big things. A successful strike was the Great Northern Railroad strike in 1894. It led to the restoration of workers' wages. They were getting paid really, really low. That was good. Then shortly after, we have the Pullman strike, and this was a huge setback for the ARU. They were not able to get the demands met for that strike. They were able to tie it into a federal issue by having like these mail cars attached, and essentially the strike was disrupting the mail, which is now a federal offense. So that was a huge setback for the ARU, and ultimately it leads to the downfall of the ARU. But for a while, it was a very important union. Another big one. So we got the KOL, the AFL, and the IWW, the International Workers of the World, aka the Wobblies. This group was set up for unskilled workers, non-whites, immigrants, women, migrant workers. This is like, give me everybody. And they were more organized, not by craft, but by industry. So you would have like your timber people, your iron workers, steel workers, whatever else. There was an IWW that represented that specific industry. The IWW was considered more radical. It was more associated with more socialist and anarchist. The socialist, of course, wanted more government control over everything, not just like rail prices, but control over industry itself. And the anarchists just wanted to take down everything. They didn't believe in any government system. They just wanted the whole thing torn down. And of course, the socialists and anarchists were usually at odds with each other. They were often fighting between themselves over messaging and what approach they should use to get better wages and safer conditions. And it was really easy for the government to attack the Wobblies because of their extreme associations and views. They would use direct actions, they would use strikes, they would use slowdowns, and they would often resort to the sabotage tactic, destroying property, destroying production lines, that sort of stuff, anything to disrupt or get what they want. They took a very firm stance against World War I in 1917 and the U.S. involvement in it. And this, of course, was basically a gift for the industrialists and monopolists, because now it made it real easy for them to portray them as these bad guys, these anti-Americans. And then they were actually charged under the Espionage Act of 1917, which basically said you can't you can't be critical, you can't speak out, you can't do anything that might undermine the U.S. involvement in the war. So if you're trying to disrupt production lines, then if we're making war goods and you're disrupting the production of war goods, that's basically a crime according to the Espionage Act. We'll talk more about that when we get to U.S. involvement in World War One. But this was sort of like the nail in the coffin for the IWW in terms of membership. From this point forward, they were considered these really intense radicals. Another sort of major group, the International Ladies Garment Workers. This one represented women. Most of the women were working in the textile industries. So this group in particular was focused on getting better conditions, better pay for women. The big incident here, most women didn't strike, but they would work for poor pay. The Triangle Shirtwaist incident, which we're mostly familiar with, and we'll talk more about that, is going to garner more attention than anything that the International Ladies Garment Workers could do. But they did do some pretty good things in terms of helping women gain equal rights in the workforce.